Right, I think we've got that here. So hello, everybody. My name is Jessica Justman, and I am a screener with Adult Protective Services. And I am joined today by my colleague, Nicole Newell, and she is a supervisor with Adult Protective Services. We do have a little bit of a change of plans today. This presentation was actually developed by our lead, Jeff Clark. But unfortunately, he is not able to be here today. So we are shunting because we didn't want you guys to have to miss this important information. So be gentle with us, please. I want to go over just a couple of things before we get started on the content here. I wanted to let you know that I am going to be delivering this presentation, but Nicole is here to answer any of your questions. So if anyone has questions during the course of this presentation, please just type those questions in the chat, and then Nicole will be kind of monitoring that and will be stopping me to answer questions as this presentation goes on. In this presentation, we will discuss some common challenges facing our elderly population and when these challenges might cross the threshold into self-neglect. Self-neglect is one of our most common referrals that we get in Adult Protective Services, but it's also one of the most challenging abuse types to understand. So I am going to go ahead and get share my screen here and get our PowerPoint started. All right, so we've got that up here. So our presentation is entitled Self-Neglect 101, No Abuse, Report Abuse. And this is part of a series of presentations that we are delivering to help promote World Elder Abuse Awareness Month, which is in the month of June. So that's why we have our June Abuse Tuesdays, where every Tuesday we're putting on a presentation. So without further ado, for many adults, or for many of us, families are a primary source of support when we age. Sometimes we're lucky enough to have support from that special someone in our life. But unfortunately, that's not everyone. We do have a lot of clients that we serve that unfortunately do not have any natural support and are kind of just out there on their own. What do you do when you struggle to keep up with your home in the day-to-day? Growing older can present many challenges. You have so many doctors between primary care and specialists. They all seem worried about different things, and you don't know which one to listen to. Then you get to the pharmacy and struggle to understand what they're telling you about all the different pills. This is something that we see pretty commonly in Adult Protective Services. Your friends call you weird, the ones that you still have. Unfortunately, again, a lot of older individuals have lost a lot of their friends. They've passed away and a lot of their family have moved away. So a lot of them are very isolated. You still know you can do the things that you love, but they're a little tougher now. Who helps you when you don't see the problems? Unless you don't plan on growing old, we all need a little help at some point. And the answer to this question on who helps you might very well be Adult Protective Services. This is a role that we definitely play depending on the situation. So I want to talk a little bit now about Adult Protective Services and specifically about self-neglect. I want to kind of go over the definition of self-neglect with you, because as with every definition, or as with every abuse type that Adult Protective Services investigates, there is a very specific definition that is defined by Oregon administrative rules. So for us, self-neglect means the inability of an adult to understand the consequences of their actions or inaction, when that ability leads to or may lead to harm or endangerment to self. So really, there's a couple of really key components here, and our next slide is really going to talk, about that piece. So, actually our slide after that. So I want to talk about a little bit about what self-neglect isn't. So again, since we know that self-neglect has a capacity component, we know that individuals don't understand the consequences of their actions. Self-neglect, is not just a situation where an individual is making a poor choice or what others might deem is a poor choice. So it's not, for example, in and of itself, a smoker who's continuing to smoke, someone with confusion that's making choices that are congruent with their values. So someone, for example, that has never seen a doctor, that's not, that's just not what they have done in their entire life. And then, they've gotten older and they still are not seeing a doctor. It's not necessarily someone who's just driving without a license. There could be a lot of reasons why someone's doing that. Could be financial reasons. Someone who's refusing treatment for a terminal illness. Again, and this is, if they have capacity to do this, this is really, their choice to make. It's their life. Someone who's continuing hobbies or activities that involve some risk. Someone that might be using drugs or alcohol. And I really want to take a second to focus on this one, because we do get a lot of calls, that individuals are, intoxicated, for example, and, they're not functioning well as a result of that. And they do present as being confused. And since that is a part of the definition of self-neglect, I wanted to let you guys know that really how we assess it is we assess capacity at baseline. So that means that, if an individual, when they're not under the influence of drugs or alcohol, is experiencing, confusion and, they're engaging in activities that, that are causing harm, that very well may be self-neglect. But if when they're not on drugs and alcohol, they are, totally fine. They don't have any capacity issues. They're alert and oriented, able to make good decisions. Then really those calls we are typically referring to, other resources for that, like drug and alcohol, treatment and counseling. It's not necessarily also refusing to move to an assisted living or closer to family. There are a lot of people that really have that value if they want to stay in their home until they pass away. And we really try to kind of respect that and help people do that as much as possible. So let's talk a little bit now then about what, now that we've talked about what it isn't, let's talk about what it is or what it could be. So again, self-neglect has a component of, confusion, of not understanding consequences of actions. So it could be that the person is experiencing confusion because of something like dementia or Alzheimer's disease. They could have a traumatic brain injury, for example, or they could have some sort of temporary condition that's causing confusion, like a urinary tract infection, or also what's commonly known as chemo brain, that the chemo radiation and medications are, altering their cognition. So there's a lot of different things that can cause confusion. The other piece to self-neglect, again, is that kind of harm piece. So, it could be things like the individual is wandering and getting lost. They don't, they go away from their home and they can't find their way back. They don't know where they are. Could be something like the person is having issues with their medication. So, they might take too much medication because they've forgotten they've taken it, or they might not be taking their medications at all. They might just be, forgetting to even refill their medications or not understanding that process. They might be engaging in activities that are really unsafe, like leaving, papers on top of the stove that could burn, causing house fires because they're not turning off their stove. They might have some financial incapacities. So they might do things like, not pay their bills, and not because they don't want to or because they don't have the money, but because they just truly don't understand that process anymore. And as a result, there might be some harm. They might have some, shut-off notices, utility notices, for example. There might be some weight loss involved because the person just really isn't remembering to eat, for example. And you might see a lot of unexplained or unnecessary trips to the ER because the person really is struggling to manage their medical care and really understand, again, kind of like those first slides, understand all of the complexities of their medical care and their medications, because it is a lot.
Jessica, we have our first question. If I may stop you. Thank you, Karen, for sending this one in. So Karen wrote, inability to understand consequences. So what about when a person understands intellectually, I know I'll run out of money in 3 years, but I don't change my spending. But they are emotionally so at risk or subject to undue influence, or has an addictive personality or personality disorders, or is so dependent for immediate gratification that they are unable to make decisions to preserve their own welfare. So Jessica, you can definitely help me out with this answer, but I think the biggest piece with adult protective services, when we understand that somebody has the capacity to make their own decisions and we feel that they are at risk still, we are going to do our best to come up with some person-centered kind of harm reduction plans. So if this person has some pretty extreme spending habits, we might talk to them about, you know, maybe is there some way to come up with a budget? Do they have a person in their life that they can bounce some ideas off of when they're interested in making a large purchase? Can they have an agreement that they call this person? So we're really looking at what is the individual's needs, and is there any sort of harm reduction plan we can come up with? If the person has capacity, they get to make those decisions on their own, right? Even if we think there may be bad decisions. So our goal really is to build as much rapport and trust with the people that we're working with and see if there's any sort of kind of harm reduction option.
Right. I'll just give it a second to see if Karen has any kind of follow-up to that. But in just a moment, I'll move on to the next slide. Thanks so much for answering questions for me, Nicole. All right, and Karen, if you do, I do see a chat bubble there, I'm sure. Karen, it's just on mine. Okay, Karen, if you do have something, feel free to put that in there. And, we can address that at the end as well. So I want to talk about that. Self-neglect is one of the big 3 abuse types that we investigate. So again, this is where we get really the majority of our calls, or a huge portion of our calls. Last fiscal year, Adult Protective Services investigated 695 allegations of self-neglect, and that represented 21.7% of all allegations that we investigated. So it's, again, something that is pretty common, and that is the ones we investigated. I mean, I think it's probably, for me as a screener, the most common screening call that I get. However, not all of the calls that we get are assigned, because again, sometimes people don't lack capacity, or sometimes there really isn't a risk of harm. Right. So now that we have explored the definition of self-neglect and shared some examples about what may or may not be self-neglect, I want to talk about some possible warning signs that someone might be self-neglecting. And I want to do this with the caveat that many of these signs could also be indicators of other issues, such as extreme poverty, for example. If you see signs, if you see some of these signs, you really may want to consider talking with the individual. If you're at all comfortable with that, you might really want to have a heart to heart with them about, hey, this is what I'm seeing, what can I do to help? Is there anything that you need? And they might really open up to you about what's going on. You would be very surprised. We get a lot of calls from just concerned neighbors and people that, just want to help and be involved. And oftentimes neighbors are a part of our safety plans with individuals. Sometimes they just don't have, again, family or other natural support. So if you see these signs, you might want to consider talking to the individual. If you don't feel comfortable with that, and that's totally understandable, you may want to consider calling it into Adult Protective Services. It's always okay to call us. Sometimes, we might not have enough information to allow for a case assignment, to assign self-neglect. But you're really an important piece of the puzzle, because there will be times, for example, on screening, where I'll get a call from, let's say, a concerned neighbor, and they'll say, the person's garbage is piling up, they're not answering their mail, but they really don't know the individual, and they don't know kind of what's going on with them, and they don't feel comfortable, kind of reaching out. And so we'll have that noted in our system, and then we might get another call, a month down the road from the person's doctor, for example, and the doctor might say, we've done this cognitive testing on them and they've scored very low, they're presenting as confused, they're presenting as not being able to take care of themselves. And really, we can kind of look at both of those referrals, because we'd always look at the previous referrals, when we're making a new case assignment, and really have a better picture or better understanding of what's going on with that individual. So again, you are always welcome to call, and even if we don't assign it, sometimes it is a really important, piece of the puzzle. So some things that you might see, some possible signs or symptoms, might be overgrown vegetation, piling up of newspaper or mail. Again, you might see like shut off notices on the door that, indicating they haven't paid their utilities. There might be bounced checks. So, I mean, if you're working with them on like a provider level, you might be seeing that. They might have some new purchasing habits or some, money transfers that just aren't looking right. I will say that we do investigate financial abuse as well. That is one of our abuse types. But if someone is being abused or scammed by an international scammer, somebody that there's really no way of kind of tracing, where that came from, those cases are not typically assigned as financial abuse, but they're actually assigned as self-neglect, because again, we're looking at, does the person have the capacity to understand the consequences of, let's say, sending money or gift cards to this individual that they don't know, that maybe is, saying that they're their boyfriend from another state. So we, that is something we often get self-neglect referrals on, as, kind of those international scam calls. It might be things like skimping on it. You might see things like somebody that is, again, struggling with medication, or they're skimping on it, struggling, with medical care. They might be wandering, getting lost. And, I have a neighbor come by and looking for their, their spouse that has passed away, a couple of years ago. You might see disorganized thoughts. They might be missing medical appointments. So especially if any of you are medical providers, I mean, that can certainly be an indication that there's something wrong, especially if they've been very good about, about keeping medical appointments in the past. You might notice in the residence squalid smells. So smells of, rotting food or feces, for example. They might have an unexplained weight loss. They might have a disheveled appearance. And again, Jeff put a caveat here that I think is really important that says, especially if a change, because there are people that, they always have had a disheveled appearance, that bathing and, hygiene care is just not a priority to them. And it doesn't have anything to do with capacity. So especially if you're seeing a change, if you're seeing somebody that's completely put together usually, and then, over time, maybe you haven't seen them in a bit and you see them and they're completely disheveled and they have dirty clothing on and whatnot. That really is something to kind of key into. So again, really kind of looking for those changes and looking for things that, especially when it's inconsistent with their values. So again, a person that has never seen the doctor, and that's their value, that they do kind of home remedies and, homeopathic treatment. They don't see the doctor. That's different than somebody that's consistently, seen their doctor every month, like clockwork, and then, stops being able to make those appointments. They might have the inability to follow through, especially with simple tasks. There might be a lack of concern, on their part of safety issues that are there. Again, we talked about the garbage accumulation. They might also have a problem with insects or rodent infestation. Again, both of those things could also just be, a result of somebody that's in, a situation where they can't afford, garbage service. But it could be, that they really don't have the capacity to coordinate that kind of service and, to figure out how to pay those bills. Could be they're having, struggles with their finances, not that they don't have enough money, but they just don't know how to get things paid. It could also be hoarding, and Jeff has a asterisk by this, because a lot of the calls that we do get about hoarding behaviors are somebody that has a variety of items that are kind of stored all over their house, and could be items, could be garbage, could be any number of things. That is something that is actually in the DSM, that is classified as a mental disorder. So it could be that hoarding, is a sign of that the person really just isn't able to take care of themselves, or it could be, something more. So that's kind of a maybe one for possible signs. Before I move on, do we have any other questions? All right.
None in the chat yet.
All right. So now that I've talked about that, I want to talk a little bit about when Adult Protective Services is involved in an investigation, what sort of things we do. And I want to preface this by saying that anytime we're involved, and Nicole kind of touched on this with the answer to her question, we are really very catered and, to that individual, or really take an individual approach. So, we might offer different things and they might just say, no, 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 no. And we really try to get creative with them about, well, what is it, what is it that would make you comfortable? What is it that you would be willing to accept? So some things we might connect them with is we might connect them with Medicaid services, for example, so they can maybe have some in-home services, or, or placement. Again, if that's something that they're interested in, certainly can help kind of get them all the information about that and help coordinate that process. We might connect them with family or other paid services. We are always doing a safety plan with the individuals. And I want to kind of take a minute to talk about this because, again, a lot of individuals think that when adult protective services is involved, our primary goal is, to get the person 24-hour care or to get the person placed outside, of the home. And oftentimes that's just not what people want. And oftentimes people have, most of the cases that we go out on that are self-neglect, many of them are not substantiated. They really don't meet that threshold. The information that we had at the time of screening, indicated that they might, and so it is assigned. But when we go out, they're doing okay. But there's these issues, as Nicole was saying, we're going to really work with them on what's going on. So safety plan doesn't always have to be, care or placement. We might be working with them on things like if they're forgetting their medications, for example. We might be working with them on seeing if they'd be interested in a med reminder. And that's, a machine that will blink and will make noise, and you just push the button and the medications are dispensed. So that can be a really, useful tool for someone that doesn't want an individual in their home, but still has, has that problem that needs to be solved. So, with adult protective services, we have to be very creative problem solvers. We might connect them with legal interventions. So, we might help them get a restraining order, for example, if there's somebody kind of taking advantage of them, or might help connect them with an attorney that, that might be able to help them with eviction. We might also connect them with an attorney for things like establishing trusts or power of attorneys. So if someone doesn't completely lack capacity, they are able to appoint another person, a power of attorney, that can help them with managing their medical affairs and their, and their financial affairs. We might help advocate with a medical professional. So we might call their doctor and say, hey, there's something going on here. This person, we're being told by, various individuals that they're presenting differently than they have, and they're having this confusion, and they really need a more thorough medical workup to figure out what's going on. Because again, we have that confusion piece. But there can be many things that are causing that, some of which are permanent and some of which are temporary. So sometimes it's just really a matter of getting that person a more thorough workup, maybe getting their medications adjusted. I mean, there's lots of things that can cause temporary confusion. And then we might also be connecting them with, emergency medical options. We might be, calling 911 depending on the situation, or helping coordinate getting them transported to the hospital.
Jessica, I do have a question. Thank you, Lee. And I think you mostly answered this. I'm just going to go over it. So would APS help someone who understands intellectually that it's time to get help, but doesn't want to go to an assisted living? So let's say this is an example where this case has already been assigned to an abuse investigator. We go out and we find that the person understands that they've got some needs, but they're not interested in leaving their house. And so, as Jessica mentioned, there are a lot of interventions that can be put into place that increases somebody's safety without requiring them to move from their home. So she mentioned, an emergency response button. You can click that if you've had a fall, if that's kind of the safety concern. If the safety concern is around medications, there's a lot of technology around there to help support somebody in remembering when to take a med and making sure that the dose is correct. So there's lots of different ways. And so that's why we're always doing a person-centered plan. We're figuring out what is the specific thing that is causing you harm or concern, and how can we work together to come up with a plan that increases your safety.
Thank you, Nicole.
Yeah.
Right, so I want to this is going to be our last slide, and then we'll have some other time for questions here. But I wanted to, before talking about guardianship, which guardianship is another intervention that sometimes adult protective services is involved with. I wanted to talk about some kind of general things with adult protective services. And we've touched on this, I think, throughout this presentation, but really haven't said it out loud. So the thing with adult protective services is one of our, if you go to, the core comps training or, any training for adult protective services, you will get information about really that we are kind of a balancing act. So Jeff had that scale earlier in there, and I think that's a really good kind of example. So that what we are balancing the ethical value, of client safety versus their right to self-determination. And self-determination essentially means free choice of one's own actions. So, and every time we're involved with somebody, we're always kind of weighing those two things. So I know we kind of said this, but again, we don't just go out and remove people from their homes, put people in facilities. We don't have the authority to do that. At times, we do assist with the coordination of a guardianship process, and the end result of that process could be that the person is placed, outside of their home. But I want to really stress that when we are helping with guardianship processes, that's really the last resort. That's at the point where we've really tried to work with the individual and really try to put some risk mitigating, services and whatnot in place. And that they really are not at a point where they're able to do any of that, and just we've been really kind of unsuccessful. So for guardianship, I'm going to kind of read off the legal definition here that Jeff has, because I think it is really important. Because oftentimes people think it should be just kind of easy to get guardianship over someone, and it definitely is not. The judge that makes those determinations here in Lane County is very pro civil rights. And so they really have to see for the individual that it meets this definition up here. So, they have to see that the person is incapacitated. So that means a condition in which a person's ability to receive and evaluate information effectively or to communicate decisions is impaired to such an extent that the person presently lacks the capacity to meet the essential requirements for the person's physical health or safety. And it goes on to say that meeting the essential requirements for physical health and safety means those actions necessary to provide the healthcare, food, shelter, clothing, personal hygiene, and other care without which serious physical injury or illness is likely to occur. So, that standard is even really a little higher than our standard for self-neglect. I mean, really that the judge is looking at, serious physical injury or illness. So, some pretty significant harm to the individual. So again, that is definitely something that we are involved in at times, but it's definitely not the most common thing we're involved in. It is something that is more rare. There are definitely situations where, where that's needed and there really is, no other choice, but it really is a last resort for us. And typically when we're involved in kind of coordinating that process, and we will typically testify at a guardianship hearing in front of the judge. The judge is the one that makes that decision, and really the judge in this county in particular, like I said, is very pro civil rights. They're really looking at, are they truly incapacitated? Are there serious risks associated with, with the way things are going? If there are no interventions, that are successful. And the thing that they also really look at is, what has been explored as far as the least restrictive interventions. That is the expectation that before anything, comes before the judge, that everything else has been explored. Really, guardianship is that last resort. So that is all that I have. Do we have any other questions that have come in?
We don't have any other questions, but I just wanted to say one more thing about guardianship. If I may, we have a couple agencies local here that do private guardianships. And we also have within the last maybe 4 or 5 years, what's called the Oregon Public Guardian and Conservator. And so that is a state-run program to help support guardians and conservators for individuals who don't have the finances to pay for a private guardian. So the situation I think that we often run into is we might exhaust all least restrictive options. We recognize that without a guardian, this person is at really high risk of harm, and they don't necessarily have the money to pay for a private entity. And so sometimes we're kind of stuck in this middle ground of we don't have a person to support them in, going through with the guardianship process. So sometimes we're reaching out to kind of relatives that maybe haven't been in contact with that person, trying to find kind of anyone in their circle, current or historical, that could potentially act in that way, because the Oregon Public Guardian, it's, like I said, it's only been here for a few years, but they are already at capacity and desperately need additional funding to support more guardianships. Okay, we have one more question here. So your definition of incapacity relates to guardianship of the person. There's also financially incapable, which relates to a need for someone to manage the estate, including conservatorship. Correct. Yeah, we didn't really get into conservatorship, but like Karen mentions in the chat, that's really more about the financial incapacity. And so that is, a least restrictive option to guardianship. If somebody is just struggling with their finances and they're not able to understand how to manage them and keep themselves safe and maybe keep their house from being foreclosed or whatever it is, conservatorship is another option. Thank you for saying that, Karen. All right, do we have any additional questions?
I am sure Jeff may have had an hour presentation planned, but since we're sort of shunting, we are, it looks like, just at the half an hour mark, so we can hold on a couple minutes too if anybody does think of anything. This could be a time to get, we do have some extra time, so this could be a time to get your burning questions answered.
Yeah, and I'm also going to put into the chat our abuse screening line. So if you have an individual that you are worried about any form of neglect or abuse, like Jessica had mentioned earlier, you are always welcome to call us. We are a resource. If we are not the appropriate entity, we will do our best to give you a referral or send your concern to the appropriate entity.
Yeah. And I think I do want to go back just for a second while you type in that, Nicole, and address Karen's kind of original question, because that really was very multifaceted. And I can tell you on screening, we definitely do get a lot of calls that are very complicated, like that maybe it isn't a capacity issue, and that it's not a permanent, condition like dementia or something like that. So a lot of times when we get those calls that are more complicated, we will be staffing that with supervisors. We have a morning meeting a couple of days a week. So we do a lot of staffing with our team, and we do that throughout the entire process of, from screening onward, because, it really does take a village. And then sometimes we'll send questions up to central office too, to have, get some guidance and support from Salem on really, what those definitions are and what we have the scope to be able to be involved in. It gets, kind of tricky sometimes between, folks that have memory issues and folks that are struggling with mental health challenges, and kind of where that, where that line is.
All right, we've got a couple more questions. Thank you, Audrey. So first question is, what is the APS follow-up on safety plans? How are folks monitored? And then the caveat of that is just thinking about folks who may not be able to remember or follow through with safety plans over time. And that's a really good point, right? And so I think when we're going out, we're looking at who is involved in this person's life. Who do they trust? Are there people that we can kind of bring into the safety plan to make sure that things are happening? So depending on the specific person, us as Adult Protective Services, we might go out every single day for a week or two until things get situated. We might go out once and never come back. We might go out once a week. It really kind of depends on how significant is the risk and what interventions can we kind of put into place that maybe feel safe, or there's other people who can call us if they're not working. So if we have no natural supports to kind of lean on, no neighbors that are interested or able to be involved, then we often kind of fulfill that role until we can get a more permanent plan.
Yeah, and can I add to that,
Please.
Nicole? Yeah. So the other thing is, we do have a timeline in which to complete our investigation. So we really are a short-term intervention. We're not a case manager that follows them kind of throughout the course of, of their life. And with that being said, if we get to the end of that, kind of timeline and we're really feeling like things are still, still kind of at risk and that we really haven't been able to mitigate that risk, to our satisfaction, then we can do something called we can open a risk case. And that is kind of gives us a little bit more time to be involved and to help kind of monitor that situation. And so there are times that we do that. There are also times that things seem like like they're moving along just smoothly, and so we might back out and we might get a call, 4, 5, 6 months down the road. And so if the person then is struggling again, we are perfectly able to open a new investigation and kind of be involved again. Maybe there's, maybe we kind of fixed one problem, but another problem, arose. And so we definitely do have people that we see, multiple times for self-neglect. And, it is one of those situations too, where every time we see them, we're kind of trying to establish that rapport. So it might be that one time, the person really isn't willing to engage with much safety planning. And again, they're maybe not at the point where, where there's either really high risk or they're not at the point where they really lack capacity. And so we do just have to kind of respect their rights and, and leave that situation alone if they're not willing to engage. But it might be something else happens and, they're more willing, they come to a point where they're like, okay, I realize I do need this help. So, our involvement is not always a, kind of a one and done situation. We often have kind of repeat folks that we'll see for self-neglect.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you, Lee. So how does someone who needs help get started into the system? So there's kind of two pieces to that. So if you are concerned about somebody else, I would say call us, and I put into the chat our abuse screening line. That's where you give us kind of all of the information you have about kind of the situation that this person is in, what they're really struggling with, it's really helpful for us to have addresses and telephone numbers, a date of birth if you have it. Jessica, this is your ballpark if you want to. What would make a really good call? What are the things you need?
Definitely, Nicole touched on demographics. And we didn't on an earlier presentation that myself and another colleague did, we touched a little bit more on eligibility criteria for someone to be eligible to receive adult protective services. We are going to be repeating that presentation this next Tuesday. So if you didn't get that, that might be definitely something that would spark your interest, because we'll talk about that, because not everyone unfortunately qualifies for our services. So some of the things that we're looking at when we're getting calls are, do they meet our eligibility criteria? So are they 65 or older, or do they have a physical disability that prevents them from protecting themselves? If they're, say, younger than 65 and their disability is related to a mental health, condition, then we would be referring that over to Lane County Behavioral Health, for example. So if you're able to get, kind of age or even approximate age, that's really helpful. If you're able to get kind of anything about kind of how they're functioning, so we can know a little bit about that disability piece, that's really helpful. And then again, that's why I really feel like, and I totally understand that not everybody is comfortable doing this, but if you have that capacity and if you have that comfort level, really kind of, if you're seeing something that looks wrong, really kind of talking with that person, because you can usually get a pretty good idea in talking with that person if, again, this is maybe just the way the person has always been and they just don't, hygiene, for example, or taking care of the outside of their yard is just not a priority for them, or if they're really presenting as confused. So, I mean, if you're able to get any sort of information about kind of how they're presenting, that's of course, very helpful to us as well, because we do have to, for each referral, kind of look at what are the causes of the concern. Is it something, is it capacity, or is it one of the, million other things it could be?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Perfect. So that's kind of if you know of someone who needs to get into the system. Now, let's say you are someone who needs help. You know that you need help. So that wouldn't necessarily meet the self-neglect criteria, because they recognize the need and they're asking for the supports. So the more appropriate referral that we would give a caller would be our ADRC. And so that's the resource connection. It's here local with Senior and Disability Services, just like we are with APS. And they would help, if somebody would meet the financial requirements for Medicaid, they would refer them to a service intake, which would, eventually, hopefully get them a caregiver in their home if they met those eligibility pieces. They would just talk to them about what is the situation. Here are the resources in the community that you might be available for. And that kind of goes into Karen's second part of her question is what is the relationship between ADRC case managers and APS investigators? And so we work really closely. We're so lucky to have them within our agency. So we have built a great connection. So we might get an investigation where the person, we go out, they definitely have some needs and they're interested in the supports. And so we will work to kind of support them through the process of ADRC getting whatever kind of resources are required for that person, if it's an intake or, kind of whatever it is. So we work collaboratively with ADRC. Sometimes we'll reach out to them on the client's behalf. Sometimes the client, will give them the number depending on the situation.
And I can speak to the case management part if you want,
Please.
Nicole. So for case management, it is a little bit different for our self-neglecting case management. So typically, if someone has an active case manager with senior and disability services, they are not actually eligible for a self-neglect investigation, even if they meet all of the other criteria. Even if they do have lack of capacity and there is some harm involved, and the reason for that, A, is it's built into our rules, but B, they have a case manager, that should be able to help them. And so we do have a relationship with the case managers as well. And so anytime that we get a referral about someone that is a case managed client that may be self-neglecting, we're going to be communicating that information with the case manager, and we're going to be offering that case manager, kind of support. There are a lot of times where it is tricky because, the case managers do have, kind of a role that is pretty complex. And, there might be referrals that come in, for example, like somebody that's been financially, that's been a victim of a scam, for example. And so usually when I get a referral like that, it's something that maybe the case manager hasn't had as much experience with or hasn't done as much. I will send them an email kind of that is like, hey, here's the situation. Like, do you need support on this? Do you need some information that you can send to your client or talk to your client about? So we do work very collaboratively with the case managers as well. And we do have a morning staffing that they're always welcome to attend. And we've made that, very clear to them. And then I don't know if you want to speak a little bit about HRT, Nicole, because that is also something that case managers and other individuals, can attend that is often really helpful.
Yeah. So one thing that we've implemented here with APS in collaboration with the Oregon Public Guardian is a community meeting that we call the high risk team. And so we come together once a month as a multidisciplinary team with service providers. So we've got the hospital, we've got shelter care, we've got cahoots, we've got sometimes police, we've got a wide, we've got the CCOs, we've got Trillium and Pacific Source. So we've got the people who are doing the things all coming together to try to problem solve and support an individual who's really struggling in our county. So it is also kind of the funnel to the Oregon Public Guardian because they're one of the attendees as well. And so our goal is really to implement all of the least restrictive options prior to getting to the guardianship realm. So again, we meet monthly, and the kind of the individuals that we talk about come from the members that are at the table. So if you are really worried about a neighbor and we assign a self-neglect case with APS, potentially that APS worker might bring the situation to our meeting and to talk about it. And that's kind of the same with case managers as well. Okay, so a few more questions here. So I'm going to go down to this one. What is the eligibility criteria for ADRC? And so I just want to say two things about that, because Karen, you had kind of mentioned before, Kate, you had called them case managers. I just want to kind of clarify. So they are a resource connection. So they are providing kind of those supports in the moment when you call, and they don't have kind of an ongoing connection to the caller or to the client. So they're not actually case managers. They're providing that, that resource connection guidance in the moment. So you can always call them again if you didn't get what you need or whatever, but anybody is welcome to call that number. And they have resources that are community-based. So it's not just dependent on somebody who's over 65 or a person with a physical disability. If you have a, you know, they fielded a lot of calls during the holiday fire around resources that were available to survivors. They have a wide array of resources at their fingertips. So if you have something that's come up for yourself or a person that you know, you can always call them. Lee, there is a statewide number. Give me a minute and I'll try to Google that. We also, with Adult Protective Services, we also have a statewide number. And if somebody calls us for a situation that is outside of Lane County, we will refer that to the appropriate county. And I would assume that ADRC would do that as well, but let me look that up in just a moment and see if I can get you a statewide number.
Yeah. A lot of the programs that, you know, that are offered through Senior and Disability Services do have very specific kind of eligibility criteria. So, I mean, that might be kind of where that question is coming from. I mean, some of the programs are, you know, 60 and above, you know, those are programs that are, you know, funded more through like the Older American Act, you know, funding. So there are definitely different programs that are only accessible to, you know, different groups, but because there are such a variety of programs offered through Senior and Disability Services. And then also just, you know, as Nicole touched on, those community programs as well, ADRC can really be a resource, you know, to anyone.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I found it. So I just threw it into the chat. Looks like we have one more, let's see, or a couple more. So Jessica, you're gonna help me with this one.
Okay.
So give an example of when you would substantiate financial abuse if a person knows they are running out of money, but still is giving money to friends. Let me scroll down, or buying things that don't make sense. And the person has an SPMI or a history of self-neglect and also history of substantiated financial abuse.
So that's tricky because I don't know that that would actually be assigned as a financial abuse allegation. I mean, it really would depend on how it comes in. But typically those type of allegations where it's really just that the person is, you know, is making decisions maybe based on incapacity, you know, would more be assigned as a self-neglect investigation. So in order for it to be, and again, certainly if you didn't catch that, the training where we talked about kind of all the different abuse types, again, there's going to be a repeat of that next week. And I'd really encourage you to attend that because we did kind of touch on this, but in order for it to be financial abuse, it would have to meet the, you know, the criteria for what's called a wrongful taking. So that would mean that there's, you know, something that's happening. I'm simplifying here, but there's something that's happening within that kind of transaction that is not, you know, normal and not okay. So it's not just somebody that's always given money, you know, to their daughter, for example, and now is in a position where they really, you know, where they really can't do that, but they're not understanding kind of the consequences. That would be more of potentially a self-neglect, you know, a self-neglect concern, especially if they're doing things like putting their, you know, their housing at risk. It would be something more like, I'm just going to give an example, like coercion. So that, you know, would be a wrongful taking by coercion. So essentially, you know, daughter comes to mom and says, hey, you know, I am going to hurt you. I'm going to beat you up if you don't give me all the money in your wallet. Mom is still giving that money in that case, but it's not, you know, it's not being freely given. You know, it's being given because of kind of what led up to that. You know, and there are, you know, there is another definition called undue influence. And I think, Karen, you spoke to this earlier in your question, and that is a really tricky one to really pinpoint, you know, is what's happening because this person has, you know, some sort of kind of influence or power or control over that individual, you know, and is kind of taking advantage of the situation versus, again, is this something that's been a lifelong, you know, pattern pattern. So as far as just that assignment, I don't know that that would be assigned as a financial abuse. Just with that limited example, it might be assigned as a self-neglect. But if we did have something that was assigned as a financial abuse, essentially the way that we get to substantiation is we use what's called the preponderance of evidence. So essentially what we're going to be doing is we're going to be completing a complete and thorough investigation. We're going to be interviewing anybody involved that might have information about the said abuse. We're going to be looking at any documents that we might have access to. We're going to be, of course, interviewing the victim. And again, doing that thorough investigation. And if when we're done with that investigation, we have to kind of weigh what we have. If more than 50% of kind of the evidence suggests that yes, that there is abuse, we're going to substantiate it. So each situation is a little bit different in the substantiation. So that's a hard one to answer because it really is just kind of at the end, it's a levying of the evidence.
Mm-hmm. And Karen, your example, what comes to mind is kind of a theme that we really struggle with are scams. And Jessica kind of touched on this earlier. We might have somebody that is alert and oriented, and they cannot be convinced that they are participating in a scam. They think, nope, that, $7 million is coming my way. I just have to pay these, $100,000 of taxes first. And we try and we try and we cannot put any interventions in. They're not interested. They don't identify a problem. And so we do our best to kind of lay out everything, all of our cards, right? Sometimes we'll bring police to a home visit to say, they agree with us, this is a scam, or, we try to get creative. But if somebody has the capacity to make an informed choice, we don't really have a lot of options. Okay, looking through the chat. So Karen, you mentioned Lauren Slovic. So Lauren actually isn't in ADRC. She is in Senior Connections, which is a different unit within Senior and Disability Services. And yes, they act as case managers. So ADRC is kind of like that initial phone call that you'd want to make. If I know somebody needs help and I don't know where to go, it's APS or ADRC. And depending on if it's maybe more appropriate for the other, then we will collaborate and send the information, back and forth or whichever way. Let's see here. Have I missed any? What is that program? So yeah, Senior Connections. So they do transportation assessments. They help people get on Meals on Wheels. They have a kind of a short-term counseling program called Pearls that's currently paused.
They're the ones also that would, if someone has a need to access the coalition grant, there's a grant that some folks might have access to for any number of things, sometimes car repairs, sometimes, I had a case where we actually used that to help pay for some guardianship costs because we were kind of in a catch-22 and, we weren't able to get the funding from the state because there was a different entity that was paying for part of it, but couldn't pay for all of it. So they can get creative. And so that's another thing. If a person's got, an unmet need and it would maybe meet criteria for applying for a grant to help, fund something, they're usually the ones that are kind of funneling that information. They also do options counseling. So, if somebody is at a point where they're ready to maybe make a choice to go, to be placed in a facility, but they really don't know what their options are, they'll talk to them about, the differences between, that not everything's a nursing home. The differences between a nursing facility and an assisted living and an adult foster care home and kind of what all those look like and really help that person, or support that person in making that choice.
Mm-hmm. They also have a program to support family caregivers and getting them some support and relief too. So thank you, Sarah, for commenting. So again, ADRC is that first point of connection. You tell them kind of the situation and what is needed, and they will be the appropriate entity to say, oh, you need a Senior Connections worker, or you need to talk to APS or whatever it is. And again, we do that as well. So if somebody calls us and it doesn't need abuse, but they didn't know where to turn, we always do our best to give resources and referrals as appropriate. Okay, so we've got another question here. Let me extend my bubble so I can read the whole thing.
And we'll give us a time check too. Looks like we've got about 6 minutes left.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're talking about undue influence and coercion. So if somebody says, I promise I'll get you XYZ, that you've always wanted if you give me XYZ, where Z could be a sign, a power of attorney. Sorry, here. Let me extend my bubble. So Karen is basically asking, so if somebody is confused and there's an individual who's saying, I'll get you this if you give me this, right? That exchange of service for whatever reason. It could potentially be coercion depending. So Jessica mentioned the situation earlier of, you know, family member coming up to mom saying, you have to give me this and I will give you, you know, or I will do this kind of thing. If there's an exchange, that doesn't necessarily mean that coercion or undue influence has occurred. But again, we always go back to capacity. Does the person understand the kind of the scenario and the situation and kind of what would follow? So if I give Jessica my entire paycheck this month, I'm not going to be able to pay my rent or buy my groceries. So she might really need some money. Do I understand that if I give her my paycheck this month, that I won't be able to meet my own needs? And maybe I've decided that I can go without, or, you know, whatever it is, but I need to be able to understand the risks and the consequences of potentially getting into that agreement. If I don't, then that could be considered undue influence or coercion potentially. I don't know if that answers your question. If not, please add a follow-up. And it looks like we've got about 3 more minutes. I don't see any other questions in the chat. So if we don't have anything that comes through, I just want to thank everybody for being here today. We really appreciate your engagement and wanting to do your part to reduce, you know, elder abuse.
All right, guys, it looks like we're going to be done just a couple minutes early. Thanks so much for all those great questions. And I think Nicole, again, put the screening line number in the chat, but I am always happy to help and always happy to field questions. So, you know, don't hesitate to give our screening line a call. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing screen now. And tell you all to have a lovely day. So thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.